If the station AI ever assigns you a partner, it means one of two things. You're about to get promoted, or you're about to become a problem. Ethan Cole read that once on a maintenance forum written by someone who sounded like they had survived both. And as the transport shuttle eased into Dockering C, he decided it was probably a joke because nothing about his assignment screamed importance. It screamed routine, the kind of job you get when someone needs a body to keep systems running and preferably not ask questions. The station itself floated 12,000 miles above a blue gas giant, its outer rings rotating just enough to simulate gravity while the inner core stayed unnervingly still, like it had opinions about motion and chose not to participate. Ethan stepped out into a corridor that hummed softly, clean, precise, faintly judgmental, as if it had already reviewed his qualifications and found them acceptable but uninspiring. He adjusted the sleeve of his standard-issue jacket and reminded himself this was supposed to be simple. 6 months, maybe a year, fix what breaks, log what doesn't, don't get noticed. The universe tended to reward people who stayed forgettable. He was halfway to the system's desk when the station AI chimed, a smooth, neutral voice that sounded like it had never once been surprised in its existence. Technician Ethan Cole, you have been assigned a partner. Ethan slowed, not stopped, because stopping would imply concern, and he preferred denial as a first response. Partners weren't unusual on larger stations. Redundancy, safety protocols, someone to blame when things went sideways. Acknowledged, he said, already imagining some overqualified engineer who would hate him on principle. The console in front of him lit up, displaying the assignment details in clean white text that didn't flicker, didn't hesitate, didn't care. He glanced at the name, then glanced again because sometimes your brain needs a second pass when reality decides to improvise. Lyra Vera. The name meant nothing to him, which was the first problem, because everyone else in the room had just gone very still, not dramatically, not obviously, just enough that the background noise of the station shifted, like a conversation lowering itself out of respect for something entering the room. Ethan felt it before he understood it, the subtle recalibration of space that happens when someone important arrives. He turned, slowly, because turning too fast felt like admitting he didn't belong here. She was already there, standing just inside the threshold as if the station itself had arranged the lighting for her. She looked almost human, same proportions, same composed posture, same calm expression, but the details refused to agree. Her skin carried a faint luminous quality, not glowing, just catching light differently, and her ears, long, elegant, tapering back through dark hair pulled into a precise braid, shifted slightly, as if listening to something the rest of the room couldn't hear. She wasn't looking at the others, she was looking at him, not casually, not curiously, but with a focus that felt like confirmation, as if he had just matched a description she'd been carrying for a long time. Ethan offered the safest thing he had, a small, dry smile that usually worked on people who didn't matter. I think there's been a mix-up, he said, because statistically speaking there had to be. She stepped closer, closing the distance to about 3 feet, close enough that the station's hum seemed to lower itself out of the conversation. Her voice when she spoke was quiet, controlled, and entirely certain. No, she said, and for a moment, Ethan had the distinct, uncomfortable feeling that the word had been decided long before he arrived. There hasn't. Behind them, the console flickered, just once, a tiny, almost embarrassed adjustment in the system log. Ethan didn't see it, but everyone else did. The line that had read assignment rewrote itself into something far more specific, pairing override. And Ethan Cole, who had come here to remain unnoticed, suddenly realized that something on this station had already noticed him first. The silence did not break after she spoke. It settled, heavier, as if the station itself had decided this moment required documentation. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose, because that was what you did when reality stopped making immediate sense. You breathed and hoped it would apologize. It usually did not, right? He said, voice steady in a way that suggested long practice pretending things were fine. Then maybe you could explain why everyone else looks like I just walked into the wrong room. Lyra did not look at the others, which somehow made their attention more obvious. Her eyes remained on him, measuring, confirming. Because you did, she said, and there was no sharpness in it, no insult. Just a statement that felt like it had been waiting for him. Ethan glanced past her, just briefly, enough to catch the reflection of a technician pretending to recalibrate a panel that had not needed recalibration 5 seconds ago. Another one had frozen mid-step, a data slate held at an angle that suggested it had forgotten its purpose. He turned back. Because looking too long at the audience made you part of the performance. Good to know, he muttered. I always enjoy being wrong in front of a crowd. Something in her expression shifted, not a smile, not yet, but a softening at the edges like tension releasing by a fraction of an inch. You are handling this better than expected, she said quietly, and Ethan raised an eyebrow because that sounded dangerously close to a test result. That is both reassuring and concerning, he replied. Mostly concerning. The console behind them chimed again, softer this time. As if it regretted interrupting, Ethan glanced back, and this time he saw it. The log entry no longer read assignment. It read pairing override initiated by authorized user. He frowned, not because he understood, but because he understood enough to know this was not standard procedure. You said the system assigned me, he said, turning back to her. That does not look like the system. Lyra followed his gaze for a moment, then returned her attention to him. It is not, she said simply. Then who authorized it? Ethan asked, already suspecting the answer in the same way you suspect gravity will still be there when you step forward. She did not rush the response. She stepped closer instead, just enough to shift the air between them, just enough that Ethan became aware of the exact distance. 3 feet became 2, and for reasons he could not immediately justify. That mattered. I did, she said, and there it was, not dramatic, not announced, just placed between them like a fact that did not require decoration. Ethan blinked once, processing. You chose your own partner, he said, because saying it out loud sometimes made things behave. She tilted her head slightly, those elegant ears adjusting with the motion in a way that felt precise, intentional. No, she corrected softly. I chose you. The distinction landed heavier than expected. Somewhere behind him a tool slipped from someone's hand and hit the floor with a sharp, betraying sound. No one commented on it, which somehow made it louder. Ethan let out a quiet breath, a short laugh that did not quite reach humor. I have been here for approximately 5 minutes, he said. I have not had time to impress anyone. Lyra's gaze did not waver. You already have, she replied, and for the first time since he arrived. Ethan felt something unfamiliar settle beneath the confusion. Not fear, not exactly. Something closer to recognition without context, like hearing a song you could not remember learning. He shifted his weight slightly, the station floor adjusting beneath him in that subtle, almost polite way it had, and he realized that whatever this was, it had started long before he stepped off the shuttle. You are going to have to be more specific, he said, because if he was already part of something he did not understand, he preferred to at least negotiate the terms. Lyra studied him for a moment longer, then turned, a small, decisive movement. Walk with me, she said, already moving as if the outcome had never been in question. Ethan hesitated exactly half a second before following, because staying would have required explaining himself to a room that had already decided he was someone else. And as he fell in a step beside her, he could not shake the feeling that the station was no longer just observing. It was waiting to see what he would do next. The corridor did not feel the same once he started walking beside her. Not physically. The gravity remained polite. The lighting stayed evenly distributed. The air still carried that faint sterile sharpness of filtered oxygen. But something underneath had shifted, like the station had decided to pay closer attention. Ethan noticed it in the way people adjusted before they reached them. A half step slower. A glance that lingered too long before snapping away. Conversations that did not quite stop but lost their confidence. As if words suddenly required permission, he kept his pace steady, matching hers without trying to lead, because leading felt like a mistake he had not yet earned. Do I get to know where we are going? He asked after a few seconds, keeping his tone light, conversational, the kind you used when you were not entirely sure if you were being escorted or relocated. Lyra did not look at him immediately. Her gaze remained forward, focused on a point that seemed to exist beyond the physical corridor. Somewhere quieter, she said, and the answer was technically helpful in the way that weather forecasts were helpful, accurate, but not particularly informative. Ethan nodded once. That narrows it down to most of the station, he replied, and for a moment he wondered if that had been too much, but her ears shifted slightly. A small, precise movement that he was beginning to suspect translated to something like restrained amusement. They turned a corner, and the architecture changed, subtly at first, the walls smoothing, the lighting adjusting to a softer spectrum that made the metal surfaces look less industrial and more intentional, like someone had designed this section to be seen rather than simply used. The foot traffic thinned until it disappeared entirely, and Ethan realized that whatever this place was, it was not meant for routine maintenance calls. He slowed just enough to notice. "This does not look like my clearance level," he said, not accusing, just stating a fact that had started to feel increasingly flexible. Lyra stopped, not abruptly, but with a controlled precision that made the stop feel deliberate. She turned to face him fully now, and for the first time since they met, there was no one else around to dilute the moment. The silence here was different. Not the kind that happened when people were watching, but the kind that existed on purpose, as if it had been designed into the space. "Your clearance level has been adjusted," she said, and Ethan let out a soft breath that might have been a laugh if it had been less tired. "Of course it has," he said, because that was apparently the kind of day he was having. He glanced past her at the sealed doorway ahead. No visible controls, no panel, just a smooth surface that looked like it would open. Only if it wanted to. "Let me guess," he added. "You adjusted that too." Lyra held his gaze, steady, unreadable in the way that suggested there was something to read if you knew how. "Yes," she said, and there was no hesitation, no apology, just confirmation. Ethan studied her for a second longer, trying to reconcile the calm certainty in her voice with the complete lack of context he had been given. "You realize this is usually the part where people start explaining things," he said, and there was a quiet edge under the humor now. Not anger, just a need for something solid to hold on to. Lyra stepped closer again, not as close as before, but enough that the space between them felt intentional, measured. "Explanations require the right questions," she replied, and Ethan tilted his head slightly, because that sounded like something someone said when they already knew the answers. "And I am asking the wrong ones," he guessed. She did not confirm it directly, but her silence shifted, a subtle change that felt like agreement. The door behind her responded then, not to a visible command, but to her presence, the surface separating with a quiet, seamless motion that suggested it had been waiting. Beyond it, the room was not large, but it carried a weight that the rest of the station did not, a low hum that resonated more in the chest than in the ears, like a distant engine or a held breath. Ethan glanced inside, then back at her. "I have a feeling this is where things get complicated," he said, and for the first time, Lyra's expression softened just enough to be unmistakable, not a smile, but something close to it, something that made her seem less like a system override and more like a person making a choice. "They already are," she said quietly. "You just have not remembered why yet." And that was the moment Ethan realized this was not about being chosen at random. It was about being recognized for something he did not even know he had lost. The room did not greet him with light or sound. It acknowledged him, and Ethan felt it the moment he stepped across the threshold. The hum beneath his feet shifting frequency like something adjusting its attention, not louder, not stronger, just aware. He paused just inside, not out of hesitation but instinct, the kind that tells you when a place expects something from you even if you do not know what. The walls curved gently inward, layered with materials that did not reflect light so much as absorb and redistribute it, giving everything a soft, deliberate clarity. At the center of the room stood a single console, not large, not imposing, but positioned with the quiet authority of something that did not need decoration to matter. Ethan glanced back at the doorway, half expecting it to close behind him in a dramatic show of commitment. It did not. It simply remained open, which somehow made the choice to stay feel more deliberate. "You brought me here to look at a desk," he said, tone dry, because humor was still the only tool he trusted in unfamiliar territory. Lyra stepped past him, her movement smooth, unhurried, as if she had walked this path many times before. "It is not a desk," she said, and the correction carried no irritation, just precision. Ethan followed her a few steps, stopping a comfortable distance away because proximity with her had started to feel like something that required conscious calibration. "Then it is a very confident table," he replied, and this time the shift in her expression was clearer, not quite a smile, but something that recognized the attempt. She reached out, not to touch the console, but to hover her hand just above it, and the surface responded instantly. Light blooming outward in thin, intricate lines that formed patterns Ethan could not immediately parse. The air itself seemed to tighten slightly, like a held breath finding shape. Ethan leaned forward a fraction, curiosity overriding caution in the quiet, practical way it always had. That is not standard station interface, he said, because understatement felt safer than asking what it actually was. No, Lyra replied, her eyes tracking the shifting patterns with a familiarity that suggested more than casual use. It is not. The lines of light adjusted, reorganizing, and then stabilizing into something that resembled data, but not in any format Ethan had seen before. It was layered, dimensional, meaning carried not just in symbols, but in the spacing between them, like a language that expected you to understand silence as part of the sentence. Ethan frowned slightly, not confused, but engaged. I am supposed to understand this, he said. More statement than question. Lyra turned her head just enough to look at him. And there it was again, that steady, searching focus that felt less like observation and more like verification. Yes, she said, and there was no hesitation. Ethan let out a quiet breath, stepping closer without quite deciding to, drawn by the structure of the display in the same way you are drawn to a pattern you almost recognize. Then either you are overestimating me, he said, or I am underestimating myself. Lyra's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer, then returned to the console. That depends, she said softly, on whether you remember how to look. Ethan's brow furrowed slightly, the phrase landing somewhere between instruction and challenge. He focused on the display again, forcing his attention past the surface shapes, past the immediate instinct to categorize, and for a brief moment, something shifted, not in the room, not in the console, but in him, a flicker of familiarity that did not belong to conscious memory, like recognizing a melody before you remember the song. He blinked, the sensation slipping away as quickly as it came, leaving behind only the awareness that it had existed at all. Okay, he said slowly, more to himself than to her. That was new. Lyra did not react with surprise. She watched him with a quiet intensity that suggested this was exactly what she had been waiting for. No, she said, and her voice carried a weight that made the words settle deeper than it should have. It was not. Ethan straightened slightly, the room seeming to adjust with him in that subtle, almost respectful way, and for the first time since he arrived, the question shifted, not who she was, not why she chose him, but something far more unsettling in its simplicity. What exactly had he already been before he forgot? The console did not dim when he lost the thread. It waited, patient in a way that suggested it had time he did not remember spending. Ethan kept his eyes on the shifting lines, forcing himself not to look away too quickly because that would feel like giving up on something he had almost understood. You said remember, he said after a moment, voice quieter now, less defensive, more precise. That implies I knew this before. Lyra did not answer immediately, and the silence between them did not feel empty. It felt deliberate, like a space designed to see what he would do with it. Ethan exhaled slowly, then leaned in again, closer this time, the patterns responding in a way he could not quite define, not changing exactly, but aligning, as if his attention itself was part of the interface. That is not how normal systems work, he added, half to himself, half to her, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a small, inconvenient thought surfaced. Maybe this is not a normal system. Lyra stepped to his side now, not in front, not leading, just close enough that he could feel the subtle shift in the air when she moved. Her presence no longer an interruption, but a constant variable. It was not built for normal users, she said, and there was something in the phrasing that made Ethan glance at her, not sharply, just enough to catch the way her eyes stayed on the display, focused, intent, like she was watching for a specific reaction. Then it was built for someone very specific, he replied. And this time his voice carried a little more weight, because the direction of the conversation had started to narrow in a way that made coincidence feel unlikely. Lyra's ears tilted slightly forward, a small, precise movement that Ethan had begun to associate with attention sharpened to a point. Yes, she said, and again, no hesitation. Ethan let out a quiet breath, the kind that comes when the possibilities you were avoiding begin to line up in ways you cannot ignore. And you think that someone is me, he said, not asking, just placing the idea between them to see if it would collapse under its own weight. It did not. Lyra turned her head toward him fully now, and the look she gave him was not curiosity, not anymore. It was confirmation waiting to be completed. I do not think, she said, softly. I know. The certainty in her voice should have been reassuring. It was not. It was grounding in a way that made the rest of the situation feel even less stable. Ethan looked back at the console, at the patterns that almost made sense, at the brief flicker of recognition that had slipped through his grasp moments earlier. Then you are going to have to explain why I do not, he said. And there it was, the first real question. Not about her, not about the station, but about himself. Lyra did not step back, did not create distance. If anything, she moved a fraction closer, enough that the space between them felt intentional, chosen, because you chose not to, she said, and the answer landed differently. Not like information, but like a memory he had misplaced on purpose. Ethan frowned slightly, not rejecting it, but trying to find where it fit. People do not just decide to forget things like this, he said, gesturing lightly toward the display, toward the room, toward the entire situation that had clearly been waiting for him. Lyra's gaze did not waver. People do not, she agreed. But you did. The room seemed to respond to that, the hum shifting again, lower, steadier, as if acknowledging the statement. Ethan stood there for a moment, the weight of it settling in slow layers, not overwhelming, just persistent, like gravity reminding you it was always there. That would imply I had a reason, he said finally, and this time his voice carried something new, not just skepticism, but a quiet, cautious curiosity. Lyra's expression softened again, just enough to be unmistakable, and when she spoke, her voice dropped slightly, more private, more certain. You did, she said, and it involved me. And that was the moment the question changed again. Not what had he forgotten, but what had he chosen to leave behind that was now standing right in front of him. The words did not echo, but they stayed, hanging in the space between them with a weight that made the room feel smaller, more focused, as if everything unnecessary had quietly stepped aside. Ethan did not respond immediately, because there are moments when speaking too fast feels like a mistake you cannot take back, and this felt like one of them. He shifted his attention to the console again, not to avoid her, but to give his mind something structured to hold on to. The patterns were still there, waiting, unchanged yet somehow more familiar now, like a door that had been locked from the inside. Involved you how? He asked finally, voice steady but lower, more careful. Lyra did not move away. Her presence remained just within his peripheral awareness, close enough to matter, distant enough to choose. You came here before, she said, and the simplicity of it made it harder to dismiss. Ethan let out a quiet breath that might have been a laugh if it had been less tired. I would remember that, he said, because that was how memory worked. It did not skip entire chapters without leaving some kind of trace. Lyra's gaze shifted to him again, and there was something in it now that had not been there before, not just certainty, but patience, the kind that comes from waiting longer than you intended. You did, she said. At first, Ethan's brow furrowed slightly, the phrase catching on something just out of reach, and then I decided I did not want to. He guessed, and the words felt strange as soon as he said them, like trying on a version of himself that did not quite fit. Lyra inclined her head a fraction, not agreement, not correction, something in between. You decided you could not, she said quietly, and that landed differently, not a choice, not entirely, more like a boundary drawn where something became too much. Ethan leaned back slightly, putting a little more distance between himself and the console, between himself and the implication that he had once stood here before. That is a very specific distinction, he said, and his tone carried a hint of dry skepticism again, not to dismiss her, but to keep his footing. It matters, Lyra replied, and for the first time there was something under her composure, not weakness, not loss of control, just a subtle shift, like a note in her voice that had been held too long. Ethan caught it, because he had always been good at noticing the things people did not say directly. Why? He asked, and this time the question was not deflection, it was direct, focused, Lyra held his gaze for a moment, and then she did something she had not done since they met. She looked away, just briefly, toward the console, toward the patterns that seemed to respond to her attention as much as his. Because if you chose to forget, she said slowly, then this is something you can undo. She turned back to him, her eyes steady again. But if you had no choice, then remembering it will change everything. Ethan considered that, not dismissing it, not accepting it, just turning it over the way he would any problem that refused to present itself cleanly. And you are hoping for which option? He asked, because that felt like the question underneath all the others. Lyra did not hesitate this time. The one where you come back, she said. And there it was, not framed as logic, not explained as necessity, just stated with a clarity that made it harder to treat as anything but truth. Ethan felt something shift again, not in the room, not in the console, but somewhere internal, a faint pressure behind a door he did not remember closing. He looked back at the patterns, at the structure that had almost made sense, and this time he did not try to force it. He let his focus relax slightly, let the shapes exist without immediately categorizing them. And for a second, just a second, the alignment returned, clearer than before. Not enough to fully understand, but enough to recognize intent, enough to feel like he was not looking at something new, but something familiar that had been waiting for him to stop trying so hard. He blinked, the clarity fading again, but leaving behind a trace, a direction. Okay, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. That is, not nothing. Lyra watched him closely, and this time there was no attempt to hide it. The attention, the expectation, the quiet certainty that he was moving in the direction she had been waiting for. It is not, she agreed softly, and as Ethan straightened, his posture shifting almost unconsciously, something about the way he stood changed, subtle, but enough that the room seemed to acknowledge it, the hum beneath his feet stabilizing into a steadier rhythm. And for the first time since he arrived, the possibility no longer felt abstract, it felt inevitable, not whether he had forgotten, but what would happen when he stopped trying to stay that way. The room did not celebrate his progress, it adjusted to it, and Ethan felt the difference not in sound or light, but in the way the air seemed to settle more cleanly around him, like something that had been waiting finally recognized the direction he was moving. He stayed where he was, eyes on the console, not chasing the clarity this time, just letting it exist when it chose to. You said I came back here, he said after a moment, voice quieter, more deliberate now. That means I left. Lyra did not answer immediately, but the pause felt different from before, not withholding, but measuring, as if she was deciding how much of the truth he was ready to hear without breaking whatever fragile alignment he had just found. Yes, she said finally, and the word carried more weight than its size suggested. Ethan nodded once, absorbing it. People usually leave places for a reason, he continued, especially ones that look like this. He gestured lightly toward the console, toward the room that clearly did not belong to routine operations or accidental access. Lyra stepped closer again, not abruptly, but with that same precise control that made every movement feel intentional. You did not leave the place, she said. You left the decision. Ethan's brow furrowed slightly, because that was not how most things worked. Decisions were not objects you could walk away from. They tended to follow you whether you liked it or not. That sounds like something that catches up with you, he said, and there was a quiet edge to it now, not resistance, but recognition of the pattern. Lyra's gaze held his, steady, unwavering. It does, she said. That is why you are here again. The simplicity of it settled into him more easily than he expected, not because it explained everything, but because it aligned with the feeling that this moment was not new, just unfinished. Ethan exhaled slowly, his attention drifting back to the console, to the patterns that had started to feel less like a puzzle, and more like a language he had once spoken fluently, and now only remembered in fragments. So what was the decision? He asked, and this time there was no attempt to soften it. No humor to deflect, just a direct line into the center of whatever this was. Lyra did not look away, did not step back. She stayed exactly where she was, close enough that the distance between them felt chosen, not accidental. Whether you would stay, she said, and the words landed with a quiet finality, not dramatic, not forced, just placed. Ethan let out a short breath, something between a laugh and a realization. Stay where? He asked. Though part of him already understood the answer would not be a location, Lyra's eyes did not shift from his. Here, she said. With me? And there it was again, not framed as a request, not presented as an option, just a fact that had once been real enough for him to walk away from. Ethan felt something tighten slightly in his chest, not discomfort, not fear, just the recognition of a weight he had carried before without remembering it. He glanced back at the console, at the patterns that now seemed to pulse with a quiet, patient rhythm, like something that had been paused rather than ended. And I decided not to, he said, because that was the only conclusion that fit the shape of the conversation. Lyra's expression shifted, just slightly, enough that the change was unmistakable, not anger, not disappointment, just a softening that felt more personal than anything she had shown before. You decided you could not, she corrected again, and this time the distinction felt more important, less like semantics and more like the difference between choice and limitation. Ethan nodded slowly, turning that over in his mind. That still sounds like a decision, he said, quieter now, because the line between the two had started to blur in ways that made simple answers feel insufficient. Lyra stepped even closer, closing the space to something more intimate, though nothing about her posture suggested pressure, only presence. Then ask yourself this, she said, her voice low, steady. If it was only a decision, why did you erase it? Ethan stilled, not dramatically, just enough that the question landed fully, settling into place like a missing piece that changed the shape of everything around it. Because decisions you regret, you remember, but decisions you cannot face, you hide. And for the first time since he arrived, Ethan realized that whatever he had walked away from, it had not been simple. It had been something he had chosen not to survive the same way twice. The question did not feel like a trap. It felt like a key, and Ethan stood very still because something about it suggested that once he turned it, there would be no easy way to pretend the door had not been opened. He did not look at her right away. He looked at the console, at the patterns that had started to feel less foreign with every second he allowed himself to stop resisting them. People erase things when they cannot live with the outcome, he said slowly, more to himself than to her, testing the logic before accepting it. Lyra did not interrupt, and the silence she gave him was not empty. It was supportive in a way that felt intentional, like she had learned exactly how much space he needed to reach a conclusion on his own. Ethan stepped closer to the console again, closer than before, and this time he did not hesitate when the patterns shifted in response. They aligned faster now, the gaps between symbols narrowing, the structure revealing itself not as random complexity, but as layered meaning. This is not just data, he said, voice quieter. Focused, it is a record. The realization came with a strange familiarity, not surprising, just delayed. Lyra's presence moved slightly behind him, not guiding, not interfering, just there, steady. Yes, she said softly, and Ethan exhaled, the air leaving him slower this time. Like something inside him was adjusting to a different rhythm. He reached out, not touching the console, but hovering his hand just above it the way she had, and the system responded immediately, not with light alone, but with a subtle shift in the room itself, the hum deepening, stabilizing, like a lock recognizing the correct key without needing to be forced. Ethan froze for a fraction of a second, not out of fear, but because the reaction felt expected, as if the system had not been surprised by him at all. That is not normal, he said under his breath, but there was less resistance in it now, more acceptance. Lyra's voice came from just behind his shoulder, closer than before. No, she said, it is not. And there was something in her tone that felt different this time, not just certainty, but something quieter, something that had been waiting longer than she wanted to admit. Ethan focused on the display again, and this time the patterns did not slip away when he tried to follow them. They held, not fully, not completely clear, but enough that he could begin to trace connections, fragments of sequences that carried intention, logic that felt like it had once been his to navigate. This is not just a record, he corrected himself. It is my record. The words came out before he could filter them, and the moment they existed in the air, something in the room shifted in response, not dramatically, just enough that the hum beneath his feet aligned into a steady, unwavering tone. Lyra did not move, but Ethan could feel her attention sharpen behind him, focused, waiting. "Say it again," she said quietly, and there was no command in it, just a request that carried weight. Ethan hesitated for a second, not because he doubted it, but because saying something out loud makes it harder to ignore. Then he exhaled and repeated it, more certain this time. "It is my record," the console responded. Instantly, the patterns resolving further, lines connecting into structures that now made sense in ways they had not seconds ago, fragments of memory not as images, but as decisions, sequences of thought, paths taken and paths deliberately avoided. Ethan's hand remained steady above the surface, though his mind had started to move faster, catching glimpses of something just beyond reach. "You said I erased it," he said, voice tighter now, more focused. "But it is still here." Lyra stepped closer again, her presence now just at the edge of contact, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her without her actually touching him. "You did not erase it," she said, and this time there was no pause, no hesitation, just truth placed clearly between them. "You locked it." Ethan's breath caught slightly, not sharply, just enough to mark the moment, because locking something meant intention, meant planning, meant he had not simply run from whatever this was. He had chosen how to leave it behind. "And this," he said, gesturing lightly toward the console, toward the system that was now clearly responding to him in ways it did not to anyone else, "is the key." Lyra's voice softened, not weaker, just more personal, more present. "No," she said gently, "you are." And that was when Ethan realized the system had never been waiting for a command. It had been waiting for him to remember that it belonged to him in the first place. The realization did not arrive all at once. It unfolded, steady and deliberate, like something that had always been there and had simply been waiting for him to stop looking at everything else. Ethan kept his hand where it was, hovering just above the console, but now it did not feel like he was reaching for something unfamiliar. It felt like he was returning to something that had been paused mid-action. The patterns beneath his hand responded again, not shifting randomly, but reorganizing with purpose, lines connecting into structures that now carried weight, decisions layered over decisions, paths branching and converging in ways that felt less like data and more like memory translated into something the system could preserve. "I built this," he said quietly, not as a question, but as a conclusion that no longer required permission. The moment the words left his mouth, the room answered, not with sound, but with alignment, the hum beneath his feet, settling into a deeper, more stable frequency, like a system recognizing its original parameters. Lyra did not interrupt, but her presence moved closer, not hesitantly, not cautiously, just naturally, as if the distance between them had always been temporary. "Yes," she said, and this time there was something in her voice that had not been there before, not just certainty, but relief, controlled, restrained, but unmistakable. Ethan exhaled slowly, the air leaving him with less resistance than before, because the confusion that had defined the last several minutes had started to give way to something more structured, more coherent. "Then whatever I locked in here," he continued, eyes tracing the now familiar patterns, "was not just information." Lyra's voice came softer now, closer, her words placed carefully. "It was a choice," she said, and the distinction mattered more than he expected. Because information could be lost, misfiled, corrupted, but a choice, a decision made with intention, that stayed, even when you tried to bury it. Ethan nodded slightly, the motion small but deliberate. "And I did not trust myself to remember it," he said, and this time there was no hesitation in the statement, no need to test it before accepting it. Lyra did not correct him, which in itself was confirmation. The silence between them shifted again, no longer a space filled with uncertainty, but one shaped by understanding that was still incomplete, but no longer directionless. Ethan looked at the console, at the sequences that now responded to him without resistance, and for a moment he allowed himself to stop analyzing, to stop trying to break it down into manageable pieces, and simply observe. And when he did, something changed, not externally, but internally, a connection forming not through logic, but through recognition, fragments aligning into something that felt less like discovery and more like remembering how to see. His hand lowered a fraction, closer to the surface, and this time the system did not just respond. It opened, layers of structure unfolding in a controlled cascade, not overwhelming, not chaotic, but precise, like a door unlocking in stages to prevent something important from being accessed too quickly. Ethan's breath caught slightly, not in shock, but in awareness, because he could feel it now, not just the system, not just the record, but the weight of the decision he had left behind, the reason he had locked it, the reason he had walked away. It was there, just beyond the next layer, just beyond the point where observation turned into commitment. If I open this, he said slowly, his voice quieter now, more grounded, I do not get to pretend I do not know anymore. Lyra stepped close enough that the space between them no longer felt like distance at all. But she did not touch him. She did not need to. Her presence alone was enough to anchor the moment. No, she said, and her voice carried no pressure, no demand, just truth. You do not. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, not to escape, but to focus, to feel the weight of the choice without the distraction of everything else, because this, finally, felt like the same decision he had made before, the same point where he had chosen to step back, to lock it away, to walk out and build a life that did not require this level of understanding. And now he was standing in the exact same place, with one difference. This time he knew what he was choosing between. He opened his eyes again, steady, the hesitation still there, but no longer in control. Last time, he said quietly, I walked away. Lyra's gaze did not waver, her presence unwavering. Yes, she said. And there was no judgment in it, only acknowledgement. Ethan looked at the console, at the final layer waiting just beneath the surface. And for the first time since he arrived, the question was no longer what had happened before, but what he would do now. His hand moved the last fraction closer, the system responding instantly, the final lock beginning to release. And just before the memory crossed the threshold into something he could not ignore, Lyra spoke again, her voice softer than it had ever been, but stronger for it. This time, she said, you do not have to leave alone. And that was the moment Ethan understood that the choice had never been just about the system. It had always been about whether he was willing to stay when it mattered most.